Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode. Hope you guys have been enjoying it. Well, I guess it's not this week's because I've already done one this week, but we're going to do a second one. And we're going to kind of switch roles now, I guess pun intended. We're going to switch from, we've been spending some time on compliance and conditional access. And we're going to talk a little bit about role-based access today and some basic concepts. And then in the next few episodes, we'll go through creating simple role-based concepts and in the Intune portal. But today I thought it was good to lay a foundation so that way we're all on the same page. If you already operate a complex RBAC environment, this is probably not going to be as useful for you. It may, however, be useful to frame or simply frame RBAC to other folks, so I encourage you to watch. And if you have any feedback on how we can make this stuff better, always ping me or comment or find me on Twitter, and we can go through stuff. So without further ado, let's get into role-based access controls. So the first slide here, I asked ChatGPT, what do you think role-based access control is? And it's basically took a definition from somewhere, but role-based access control effectively is the ability for you as an administrator to limit what people can do, what they can see, and what they can impact, right? That's how I sort of think about role-based access control. And that concept is pretty much the same across any tool that implements RBAC. All of the mechanisms might be different or might have differences, but that high-level principle of what I can do or what someone can do, what they can see, and what they can impact, right? Pretty much holds true across the board. So first, let's talk a little bit about how Intune does these things, right? So Intune has the three concepts that we talked about. It has the concept of what people can do, like a permission, what people can see. We refer to that as a scope or a scope tag more specifically. And then what you can impact, right? And for us in Intune, that's referred to as a scope group. And we'll get into a little bit more about each one of those things as we sort of move along here. So the first one, let's look at the first one. And the first one is, what you can do. So we refer to this in Intune as a permission. And we have a bunch of permissions. Those are in our documentation, and they're really easy to find. However, it can be really difficult to understand what permissions you need to do certain functions because RBAC, or role-based access control, is very granular, right? So when we take permissions and we bundle them into something to deploy to someone, we refer to that as a role, right? Now, there are built-in roles in Intune, and I would really suggest if you're using RBAC for the first time that you start with built-in roles and then modify those built-in roles as you go along, right? So you might start with something like help desk administrator or endpoint security manager, and then realize where those roles might have too many or too little permissions, and then copy or duplicate those roles and add or remove things versus creating roles from scratch. There's nothing wrong with creating roles from scratch. However, if you're just learning or just starting for the first time, you may get into a lot of trial and error, and it may be a less than optimal experience for you trying to configure RBAC. Some examples of permissions that are bundled into roles are things like device compliance, device configuration, security baselines, which is our endpoint security permission, permissions around apps, the RBAC permission itself, like the ability to delegate roles, all that sort of stuff. So if you want a complete list, go to our documentation, and there's pretty good definitions of all of those roles. In Intune, the second concept that we have is, sort of like what you can see. And we refer to these as scope tags. So you see scope tags, and usually when you assign a permission, just for kicks here, when you assign permissions or roles to people, you choose the role that you're going to assign, the scope tags to which you're going to assign it for, and then the scope groups, which we'll get to in a second, that you can affect with this permission, right? So, scope tags are assigned to objects in the Intune console and are used to remove UX experiences or remove sort of experiences where you view data about your environment from administrators. So what's an example? I may create a scope tag called Scranton Office, right? And I may assign that to all the Scranton Office devices. Then when I go ahead and create a role, or I create like the device configuration permission, I would assign or give the scope tag for Scranton office. And now any policies that I create, I can add the Scranton office tag to. This becomes really important when you think about what you want administrators to see when they go into the console, when they view anything like reports, or they view device lists, or they view app lists, or policy lists. They only see everything with this Scranton tag. So you can sort of unify all of their sort of views underneath this tag. And administrators can have access to more than one tag, right? So the ability that you have to access content is the presence of a tag in your role, not an exclusive tag access, right? So these are tags. You can have multiple. It doesn't matter. You can assign those to objects. We'll look at that next time. And then the last thing is what you can impact in Intune, which is also referred to as a scope, but specifically in Intune we refer to these as scope groups. Now these are literally Azure AD groups that you say these users can assign whatever permission you're delegating out, these objects or things that use this permission to this group, right? So this is commonly used to allow maybe engineering to deploy policies to test groups, for instance, but not be able to deploy to production groups, right? So that way you can do all of your testing and whatever in the in your initial sort of pilot or POC groups, but then a broader rollout would require somebody that has greater scope or the ability to impact greater number of devices. The same concept can hold true if you have, if we go back to our Scranton office scenario again, you may have groups already of Scranton office devices that you deploy scope tags to. If you give that same administrator scope group access to the Scranton devices group, they can create policy and deploy that policy to those groups, making sure they can only impact the devices that they have quote unquote scope to. The other thing that's interesting about scope groups is you only have permission to modify objects that are deployed to groups that you control, right? Or groups that you have access to impact. So we commonly see this come up when you created a policy A, you deployed it to group A, which is inside of your scope. Everything works great. And then another administrator comes along and deploys it to group B. Well, you don't have access to group B, right? So if you go in to try and create, update, or delete that policy that you had created, now you'll get errors because any changes to that policy would affect group B, and you do not have access to impact group B, which is super important. It's important when you start looking at RBAC that you start simple. Start with a simple set of controls and a simple set of scopes, so that way you can tailor them to your environment over time. Often the biggest mistake that I see organizations make is they go in and they try and create this complex RBAC sort of model and try and start from this completely custom place. And that is hard, right? Because RBAC is a complex concept and the implementation changes across tools a lot of the times. But it's also dangerous because you end up adding permissions to make things work, and you sort of do the opposite. You can introduce sort of holes in the environment that were unintentional because you're dealing with sort of, I would say, escalations or cascading impacts of creating these custom roles. So that's all for now. That's a brief introduction. Next week or next time, whenever I decide to do it, I think it'll probably be early next week, we'll go briefly into creating and delegating a role, and we'll see how that works inside of the console, what the differences are for administrators, so that way you get more of a grasp on what's going on. I'm at 9 minutes. These keep getting longer. I swear to God, they won't get any longer. I'm going to try and keep them short. But until next time, we'll see you all later.